I've been doing a lot of thinking in parking lots lately. That probably sounds strange, but there's something about sitting in a car with the engine off, watching other people walk in and out of their ordinary lives, that makes it easier to think clearly. I had been doing that a lot in the months before the night everything changed, sitting in parking lots, in the driveway, sometimes in the garage with the door still open, just thinking. The signs had been there. I was 62 years old and I had been married for 34 of those years, so I knew what a marriage looked and felt like from the inside. I knew the texture of it, the comfortable silences and the not-so-comfortable ones, the way a man reaches for his phone differently when something is wrong, the way he smells when he comes home later than he said he would. I had noticed all of it. I had cataloged every small detail with the precision of someone who desperately did not want to believe what they were cataloging. My husband was the director of operations for a mid-sized pharmaceutical distribution company outside of Columbus, Ohio. He had worked there for 19 years. The company organized a large charity gala every December, a fundraiser for a children's hospital foundation, held at the Ashwood Manor event venue, which is the kind of place that charges you $400 a plate and makes you feel like the price was reasonable. Black tie, auction paddles, string quartet until 10, and then a DJ who played soft rock for people who thought they still liked to dance. I had attended every single one of those galas for 17 years. Then, 2 years ago, my husband told me the company had changed its policy about spousal attendance, something about optics and vendor relationships, and a new corporate restructuring. He explained it in that particular way he had developed, calm, detailed, slightly impatient with any follow-up questions, as if the effort of explaining was itself proof that there was nothing worth questioning. I believed him the first year. The second year, I started asking a colleague's wife, a woman I had known for a decade, whether she was going to the gala. She looked at me with an expression I will never forget for as long as I live. It was not pity exactly. It was the look of someone who had been wondering for a long time whether you knew something and had just received their answer. She said spouses were absolutely still invited. I sat with that information for 3 weeks. I turned it over the way you turn over a stone you found in your garden and aren't sure whether to be curious about what's underneath or to simply put it back and walk away. I am not a woman who walks away. I never have been. My mother raised me in rural Kentucky with the very firm belief that the truth, however terrible, was always better than a comfortable lie. She used to say that a lie was just a wound that hadn't started hurting yet. I am also not a woman who confronts without evidence. I had learned that lesson once before, early in our marriage, when I accused my husband of something he hadn't done and spent 2 years rebuilding the trust I had damaged. I was not going to do that again. This time, I needed to be certain. The gala was 4 weeks away when I called the Ashwood Manor events coordinator and asked whether they needed any additional volunteers for the evening. The charity component of the event always used outside volunteers for things like registration, bid sheet management, and coat check. I explained that I was a retired school administrator with a lot of event experience. She said they would love to have me. I did not tell my husband. I told him I was going to spend the weekend with my sister in Dayton. My sister, who knows everything about me and has kept every secret I have ever given her, confirmed she would cover for me if needed without me even having to ask. That is what 60 years of sisterhood looks like. The night of the gala, I dressed practically black slacks, a white blouse, flat shoes. The venue provided navy blue volunteer vests. I pulled my gray hair back tightly, which I almost never do. I wore reading glasses instead of my contacts. I am not a small woman, and I have a face that my husband once said he could pick out of any crowd in any city on earth. Standing in the volunteer staging area near the main entrance, adjusting that vest in the reflection of the glass door, I thought, we'll see about that. The other volunteers were mostly younger college students, a few retirees from a local church group. The coordinator, a cheerful woman named Brianna, assigned me to the registration table just inside the main doors. My job was to check names against the guest list, hand out name badges, and direct people toward the cocktail hour. I would see every single person who walked into that building. I want to be clear about something. I went there hoping to be wrong. I want you to understand that. I had constructed an entire alternate explanation in my mind. Maybe my husband had simply been embarrassed to tell me the spousal invitation policy had changed back. Maybe there was some other reason he hadn't wanted me there. Maybe I was about to spend an evening confirming that my imagination had been the real problem all along. I would have accepted that. I would have driven home, taken off that volunteer vest, and never said a word. I would have been grateful. The first hour was uneventful. I checked in vendors, board members, and their spouses. I smiled and said, "Enjoy your evening," approximately 40 times. I was very good at the job. Old habits from school administration. My husband arrived at 7:15. I saw him before he saw me, which is exactly what I had needed. He was wearing the charcoal suit I had given him for his 60th birthday, the one I had driven 40 minutes to a specific tailor in Dublin to have properly fitted because I wanted him to look distinguished at events like this one. He looked distinguished. He was laughing at something. He was not alone. The woman beside him was younger, I would later estimate late 30s. She was wearing a deep green dress, and her dark hair was pinned up with the kind of careless elegance that takes considerable effort to achieve. She was holding his arm, not in the polite, social way that colleagues sometimes do. In the way that people hold on to something that belongs to them. I watched him scan the registration table from 15 feet away. His eyes passed over me. Moved on. Moved back to her. He did not recognize me. I felt something settle in my chest in that moment, not the crack I had been bracing for, but something quieter and stranger, a kind of clarity, like the moment just after a very loud noise when the silence is almost physical. I looked down at my clipboard. I found his name. I picked up his badge and her badge. She was listed as his +1, which meant he had registered her weeks ago, which meant this was not spontaneous, which meant everything, and I walked the few steps to the end of the table where they had stopped. "Good evening," I said. "Can I get your names?" My husband said his name. He was looking past me toward the ballroom entrance, describing something to her about the layout of the space. I handed him his badge. I handed her hers. I said, "Enjoy your evening," and I meant none of it, and all of it simultaneously. He said thanks without looking at me. They walked into the ballroom. I stood at that registration table for another 45 minutes. I checked in the rest of the guests. I answered questions about where the restrooms were and whether the auction items were on display near the bar. I was perfectly pleasant to every single person. Inside, I was doing the kind of arithmetic that no one wants to do, counting backward through years, recalculating events, reinterpreting things I had been told and things I had been shown and things I had simply believed because I had wanted to. Brianna asked me at one point if I was feeling all right. I told her I had a slight headache, but I was fine. At 8:30, she released the registration volunteers since all guests had arrived. She thanked us and pointed us toward a staff break room where there were sandwiches and coffee. The other volunteers went. I did not go to the break room. I walked to the back edge of the ballroom, where the lighting was lower, and the caterers moved between the kitchen and the tables with the kind of focused efficiency that makes them effectively invisible to guests. I stood near a pillar with a glass of water and I watched. My husband was at table 7. I could see him from where I stood. He was comfortable, animated in a way I hadn't seen in some time, leaning in to say things that made her laugh, touching the back of her chair, touching her hand twice in the space of 20 minutes. He was performing a version of himself I recognized. It was the version I had fallen in love with. I had thought that version had simply faded with time and stress and the ordinary erosion of a long marriage. I understood now that it hadn't faded. It had just been redirected. The program began around 9. The CEO, a man I had met at many of these events over the years, stepped to the podium to welcome everyone and give the fundraising update. He was followed by a representative from the Children's Hospital, who spoke about what the previous year's donations had funded. It was genuinely moving. I stood in the back of that ballroom with tears in my eyes for reasons that had nothing to do with the speech and everything to do with it. Then the CEO returned to announce the top fundraising team of the year. This was a traveling trophy, a piece of crystal shaped like a compass that was passed around internally with some ceremony. He named the team. He named the 2 co-leads. He named my husband first, and then he named her. They had led the company's internal peer-to-peer fundraising campaign together. They had raised over $80,000. The CEO called it a true partnership. He said that phrase with the particular warmth of someone who admired what he was describing, who had no idea what he was actually describing. The table applauded. The room applauded. She put her hand over her mouth in a gesture of surprised delight. My husband put his arm around the back of her chair and pulled her briefly toward him, and the people around them laughed with the affectionate recognition of people who had been watching something develop for a long time. I set my water glass down on a nearby tray. I had come here to find out if I was wrong. I was not wrong. I had come here without a plan for what happened if I was right. That turned out to be not entirely true, because as I stood there watching the room applaud a partnership I had not known existed, I found that I did know what I wanted to do. I had known for a long time, actually, in the way that you sometimes know things before you're willing to admit that you know them. I was ready to stop not admitting it. I walked to the edge of the stage area. Brianna was standing nearby, managing the program flow, and I caught her eye and told her I needed 2 minutes at the microphone after the current presentation concluded and before the auction began. I told her there was a tribute I had been asked to deliver on behalf of one of the board members who had been unable to attend. Brianna, who trusted me because I had spent the entire evening being exactly the kind of reliable, pleasant, organized volunteer that people trust, said absolutely and penciled me in. I straightened my volunteer vest. The applause for the fundraising announcement died down. The CEO returned to the podium to introduce the auction portion of the evening. He mentioned briefly that a board tribute would precede it and gestured to me as I stepped forward. I took the microphone. I looked out at the room. 230 people in formal wear, holding champagne flutes, settling back into their seats for what they expected to be a brief piece of organizational business. My husband was at table 7. He was looking at the stage with the politely attentive expression of someone waiting for a minor event to conclude. His eyes found me. They moved away. They snapped back. I watched the recognition move through him like weather. I said, "Good evening. My name is Carol. I've been the wife of one of your colleagues for 34 years. The room was very quiet. I want to start by saying that this is a beautiful event, and the work you all do for that Children's Hospital Foundation is genuinely important. I mean that sincerely. I have attended this gala for 17 years, and I've always believed in what it stands for." I paused. I also want to say that I came here tonight in a volunteer vest because my husband told me spouses were no longer invited. I found out 3 weeks ago that wasn't true. I thought about calling him from the parking lot and asking why. Instead, I spent the evening at the registration table, and I watched. The silence in that ballroom had a texture to it now. 230 people who understood exactly what was happening. I'm not here to cause a scene. I'm not here to embarrass anyone beyond what the facts themselves accomplish. I'm 62 years old and I have spent 34 years building a life with someone, and I think I deserve the dignity of saying out loud, in front of the people who have apparently known for some time, that I know. That's all. I know. I looked directly at my husband. He had gone very still. She had turned away from him, which told me something about her too, not cruelty, not defiance, but the particular shame of someone who is not, at their core, entirely comfortable with what they've been doing. To the woman who received the Compass Trophy tonight, I said, and I made sure my voice was steady, I don't know your full story, and I'm not going to pretend I do, but I hope you'll think carefully about the foundations you build things on. I set the microphone back in its stand. I walked off the stage. I walked through the ballroom toward the main doors. People moved to let me pass. No one said anything, which I was grateful for, because I did not want comfort in that moment. I wanted air. I pushed through the front doors of the Ashwood Manor into the cold December night, and I stood on the stone steps, and I breathed. My husband came through the doors 4 minutes later. I know because I counted. He had taken 4 minutes to decide what to do, and what he had decided to do was come outside, which told me he was more concerned about me than about what he'd left at table 7, and I filed that information away in the complicated place where I was keeping everything about that evening. He said my name. He said he could explain. He said a number of things that people say when they have been found out and are not yet sure which explanation might work. I let him talk for a little while, not because I believed anything he was saying, but because I had been with this man for 34 years, and I thought he deserved the time to say it, and I thought I deserved the time to hear it and know with absolute certainty that it changed nothing. When he stopped talking, I said, "I'm going to go home now. I'm going to sleep in my own bed. Tomorrow I'll call my attorney, and then we'll figure out the next steps." He said he didn't want that. I said, "I know you don't. But what I want matters too. It always did. I just stopped acting like it for a while. I walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment in that parking lot with the engine off, which is where I had been doing my thinking for months now, and I thought, this is the last time I will sit here like this. From here, I move forward. I drove home. I want to tell you about the months that followed because I think people sometimes assume that the moment of confrontation is the end of the story, the dramatic peak after which everything resolves itself neatly. That is not how it works. What follows a moment like that one is a long, unglamorous, frequently exhausting process of dismantling a shared life and figuring out what belongs to you. There are attorneys and paperwork and difficult conversations about the house and the retirement accounts and the dog, who ultimately stayed with me because she had always been more my dog than his, and we both knew it. There are also phone calls you don't expect. His sister called me 6 weeks after that night and cried and said she was sorry. Several of the wives I had known from company events reached out, women I had liked but never known well, and the kindness of their messages surprised me in ways I was not prepared for. You find out who people are when a crisis strips away the social scaffolding, and most of the people I encountered were better than the situation called for. My husband and I did not have a dramatic falling out. We had a series of tired, honest conversations, most of them sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, which is where we had made most of the important decisions of our adult lives. He admitted everything. Not all at once, it came in layers, the way these things do. The relationship with her had been going on for 2 years. It had started, as these things often do, as something he had convinced himself was innocent for longer than it was. He was not a monster. He was a man who had made choices he had not been brave enough to be honest about, and who had therefore made everything worse than it needed to be. I told him I forgave him, and I meant it. Though forgiveness is a more complicated thing than people make it sound. It is not a door that swings open and stays open. It is something you do repeatedly, on ordinary days, when the anger comes back unexpectedly and you have to choose again whether to hold on to it. I chose, most days, not to. That was for me, not for him. The house sold in the spring. I had always wanted to move closer to my sister in Dayton, and now there was nothing keeping me in Columbus. I found a small house with a deep porch and a backyard that the dog approved of immediately, which I took as a good sign. My sister lives 8 minutes away. We have dinner together on Thursdays and sometimes on Sundays too. I had not realized, in all those years of my marriage, how much I had missed the particular ease of being with someone who has known you since before you became whoever you became. I am not going to tell you that I am happy in some uncomplicated magazine cover way. I am 63 now, and I live alone for the first time in my adult life, which has its difficult hours. There are evenings when the house is very quiet in a way that feels like an absence rather than a choice, and I allow myself to feel that without pretending it is something else. My mother would not have approved of pretending. What I will tell you is that I am honest now in a way that I was not before. Not harsh. I have no interest in honesty that is really just cruelty wearing a cleaner jacket, but honest about what I want and what I will accept and what I will not. Honest about when I am struggling and when I am not. Honest in the parking lots, with myself, in the quiet. I think about that December night more than I probably should, but less than I once did. I think about the moment I stood at the registration table and handed my husband his badge and watched him walk away without seeing me. I think about what it meant to be invisible to someone who had promised to know me. And I think about standing at that microphone with my volunteer vest and my reading glasses and my gray hair pulled back, and deciding that invisible was not something I was willing to be anymore. My daughter asked me once whether I regretted doing it the way I did publicly, in front of his colleagues, at a charity event. She is practical and composed, and she worried about the collateral discomfort to people who had simply come for an auction. I understood her concern. I told her, I spent years being quiet about things I should have said out loud. I spent years adjusting myself to fit around someone else's discomfort. The one time I decided to take up the space I was entitled to, I do not regret it, even if it was inconvenient, even if it was public, even if some people had their charity auction delayed by 3 minutes because a 62-year-old woman in a Navy volunteer vest decided she was done pretending. She thought about that for a moment and then she said, "Fair enough, Mom." That is the most my daughter has ever said in response to anything I have told her, and I consider it the highest praise. I went back to the Ashwood Manor once, about a year later. Not for an event. I was passing through that part of town and I just pulled into the parking lot and sat there for a moment. Same stone steps, same glass doors. In December again, but earlier in the month, no event that night. The building was lit, but quiet. I thought about the woman who had stood on those steps in the cold, breathing after doing the hardest thing she had done in a very long time. I thought about what I would say to her now, if I could. I would tell her she was right to stay, not in the marriage in herself. To stay present in her own life when it would have been easier to become smaller, to doubt, to disappear quietly into someone else's version of what was happening. She stayed, and she saw clearly, and then she did what needed to be done. That's enough. That's really more than enough. I pulled out of that parking lot and drove home to my dog and my porch and my sister 8 minutes away, and I did not look back. You don't always have to.